Why you wouldn't survive a medieval castle siege. Okay, hold on a second. Right now you're sitting in your comfortable chair, phone in hand, or coffee in front of the TV watching this video, and you're probably thinking, man, it would have been so awesome to live in the Middle Ages. Knights, epic sword fights, maybe a little Game of Thrones drama. All right, stop right there. Erase that romantic and glamorous medieval fantasy from your head. Because today I'm going to tell you something very, very important. You, yes you, the modern era Wi-Fi addict who can't do anything without your morning coffee, who carefully adjusts the shower angle muttering, "Turn it down a little, it's too cold." You would have died inside a medieval castle siege in approximately 5 to 7 days. Scientifically, historically, with documented evidence, and even that estimate is being generous. This video isn't sponsored, but I wish it were because what I'm about to tell you is so awful that nobody would do this without getting paid. Anyway, let's continue. Now here's the scene. It's the 1200s. In the middle of France, there's a stone castle. And out of nowhere, this castle gets surrounded by a massive army with absolutely no way out. The siege begins. And you're inside this castle. Maybe as a soldier, maybe as a peasant, maybe as an unfortunate baker who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. At this point in the story, what you are is up to you, but not what you are. What will happen is certain. And I'll give you the spoiler right now. It doesn't end well. First of all, you need to understand what a siege actually is. A siege basically means this. An enemy army shows up, surrounds the castle, and says, "Come out or die inside." Looking at history, this strategy was an extremely effective tactic for that era. But if you're the one on the inside, this strategy is going to make you say, "My real enemy is the YouTube algorithm." It's that maddening. Because a siege isn't just arrows and swords like you might think, and in fact, the arrows and swords are practically the nice part. What actually kills you is something far more quiet, far more disgusting. Sanitation. The toilet situation. Now think about it. Inside the castle, there are maybe 500, maybe 1,000 people. Soldiers, civilians, women and children, the elderly, horses. Yes, horses too, remember that. Normally, these people wouldn't all be crammed inside the castle. They'd be out in the fields, by the river, everyone going about their own business. But once a siege begins, everyone is forced to take shelter inside the walls. And all of these people, every single day, have to take care of their biological needs. Now, in the 21st century, what do? You grab your phone, head to the bathroom, maybe scroll for a bit, flush, wash your hands in the sink right next door. Total time, 10 to 15 minutes. In the Middle Ages, things worked completely differently. If you were lucky, there was a garderobe inside the castle. And no, not the wardrobe you're thinking of in the Middle Ages. This word referred to a kind of small protruding structure, a platform jutting out from the castle wall with an open bottom. So basically, you'd step out, sit down, and gravity took care of the rest. This system was ecologically sustainable, but socially extremely problematic, especially when the castle was under enemy siege, because these platforms were right in the target zone of enemy archers. So at some point, you go out to sit down thinking, it's a little chilly today, and an arrow pierces right through you, and that's your last bathroom trip ever. Pro gamer move of the century, right? But the real disaster is only just beginning. As the siege dragged on, and some sieges could last for months, even years, the waste inside the castle started piling up. Human and animal waste seeped into the ground, into the basements, into the water wells, and this is where history's greatest villain makes his entrance: typhoid, dysentery, and cholera. These three were the real DLC bosses of a medieval siege, and nobody wanted to buy them. Dysentery was the most dangerous of the bunch. Days of diarrhea, vomiting, and dehydration. And imagine dealing with that inside a castle, completely surrounded with barely enough water. This is literally playing with permadeath on. Historians say that many sieges ended in surrender, not because of the enemy's show of force or multiple assault waves, but because of the disease raging inside the castle. During King Edward I's siege of Stirling Castle in 1304, the majority of the defenders lost their lives to disease alone. No sword fights, no arrows, just pure anti-sanitation. This is the kind of betrayal that sits at number 1 on history's top 10 anime betrayal list, and yet nobody ever talks about it. But wait, you say, I'm a warrior, I'm strong, disease can't touch me? My dear naive viewer, that exact mindset is precisely what would get you killed in the 1200s. Because physical strength is irrelevant here. To survive, you need a strong immune system and, of course, a psychologically resilient mind. Even in most sieges, soldiers died of disease at higher rates than civilians because they were all sleeping together in cramped spaces, sharing the same water sources, and their immune systems were already wrecked from chronic malnutrition and stress. All it took was one person getting sick for the illness to spread rapidly through the ranks. Let's also add this. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was nearly unavoidable during siege conditions in the Middle Ages. Teeth falling out, internal bleeding, joint pain, and all of it just from not being able to get fresh fruits and vegetables. Today you drink a smoothie for your daily vitamin C. In the Middle Ages you were eating rotten grain instead of that smoothie. The difference? About 6 centuries and a whole lot of death. Now let's move on to the next scene. The part most movies show and everyone loves, boiling oil. Ah yes, that iconic image. Defenders pouring huge cauldrons down from the castle battlements, enemy soldiers screaming below, dramatic music playing. Very cinematic, very exciting, but completely wrong. Well, partially wrong. Not everything is like it is in the movies. Yes, boiling liquids were used, but mostly not oil. Oil was considered extremely valuable back then and was expensive. They only used it for cooking. You're starving and you're going to pour your last cauldron of oil on the enemy? No, that's not a survival strategy. Or it was an epic but impractical gesture born of someone's last desperation. What was actually more common was boiling water, sand and fish oil, and sometimes even bees. Yes, bees. Defenders would hurl beehives at enemy soldiers. This is simultaneously the most absurd and the most genius military tactic in history, and they absolutely need to put this in textbooks. When people said biological warfare, nobody was thinking about bees, but it worked. Throwing a beehive was the medieval equivalent of using your ultimate ability. High cooldown, but the effect was guaranteed. But we're still inside, remember? You're still in this castle trying to survive with dwindling food supplies and worsening sanitation conditions. Now let's talk about the food situation. The enemy army's basic strategy for speeding up a siege was simple. Wait. Just wait. Surround the castle, block anything from getting in, and either the people inside starve and surrender, or they die inside, and you open the gate yourself. This strategy genuinely worked most of the time, and the people inside the castle didn't give up quickly. They started by consuming the animals. First the horses go, then the dogs, then the cats, and finally the rats. Yes, rats. Historical records document castle defenders eating rats during more than one siege. And worse than that, in some cases it's documented that they boiled leather and consumed pieces of rotting meat they found more valuable than a decent bone broth. This is survival mode hardcore. But this time there's no pause option and no respawn. Let's get to one of the most critical issues, water. As a modern person, you get water by turning on a faucet. But as a medieval castle defender, you're either using a well or collecting rainwater. The well was an incredibly precious asset inside the castle. But the well has a capacity because everyone stuck in the siege is using it. On top of that, the sanitation problem I just described gradually contaminates these water wells too. Groundwater could be affected by waste seeping through the soil. You're trapped in the castle, hungry, sick, and thirsty all at once. That triple combination is something today's athletes only experience in the most extreme ultramarathon races. But in the Middle Ages, this was these people's morning routine, metaphorically speaking, because there was no real breakfast to speak of. Now let's move on to something that breaks people down just as badly as hunger. Psychology. The psychology of people trapped inside a castle for an extended period. Today, when you stay home for a few days, you experience quarantine fatigue, you complain on social media. Maybe you download a new game or start a new series. In the Middle Ages, none of that existed. The people inside the castle were trying to survive for months, sometimes more than a year, in an environment where death was knocking at the door at any moment. The psychological devastation of this is beyond anything you can imagine. People, having lost their mental stability, were constantly irritable. Fights broke out regularly, and sometimes a faction inside the castle would offer to open the gates and surrender to the enemy, an act that falls squarely in the top 10 anime betrayal category. Trust in the leaders kept eroding, hope ran dry, and eventually, some people would think, I'm going to die either way. At least let me die fighting and walk right out the gate. This was a rage quit moment seen throughout every era of history, and honestly, from a human perspective, it's completely understandable. And then there are the siege engines. If the enemy didn't want to just wait and preferred to take the castle quickly, they could launch an active assault. The trebuchet, catapult, mangonel, these were the medieval long-range weapons of war. Think of them as the howitzers of the modern era. The trebuchet was considered the most legendary of them all. Some historical examples show it could hurl stones weighing around 150 kilograms hundreds of meters. It wasn't just a war machine, it was an engineering marvel, but when it was being aimed at you, the admiration quickly turned to dread. And beyond stones and iron balls, which we all know about, the enemy also launched dead animals, rotting corpses, and infectious waste materials. This was the 14th century's version of biological warfare, and the people trapped inside the castle paid for it with their lives. It is historically documented that during the siege of Kaffa, Mongol forces catapulted the corpses of plague victims into the city, which is believed to have helped set the stage for the Black Death's spread into Europe. This is a real historical event and simultaneously the most horrifying area of effect attack in history. As always, throughout all of history, humanity has been busy causing damage to nature. Now let's move on to the part everyone talks about and eagerly awaits, and the side of the boiling oil scene that most people don't know about. Enemy soldiers sometimes didn't settle for waiting and went straight for a direct climbing assault. Wooden ladders, siege towers, battering rams against locked gates. The defenders meeting these attacks rained down spears, arrows, and stones. If you consider a stone falling from 10 to 15 meters up, the results for the receiving end are not pretty at all. It wasn't a rock falling on your head, it was a mass that would split your skull open. Defenders in this sense were using the high ground advantage, a tactic that recurred as a winning strategy throughout history. Star Wars taught us that too. Now let me tell you about the least talked about but perhaps the most maddening aspect of a siege: tunneling. Yes, tunneling. Enemy engineers, called sappers in the Middle Ages, meaning diggers, would tunnel under the castle walls. The plan was this: dig all the way beneath the wall, use timber to prop it up, then once you've pulled out, set the timber on fire, the wall collapses at a point, and you walk right in. This strategy was one of the greatest underrated pro moves in medieval siege history. Now think about this. You're inside the castle. They're attacking from above with catapults and arrows. You're hungry and thirsty. You're fighting off disease on the other side. Your psyche is in ruins. And as if all that isn't enough, they're digging right beneath your feet. Do you get that? It's coming from underground. This is literally like someone trying to win a game by using cheats. Historically, this tactic worked in many battles. During the 1215 siege of Rochester Castle, the forces of English King John used this method, poured pig fat into the tunnel and set it on fire, and the tower wall actually collapsed. You want drama? Here's your drama. But this time it's coming from underground, and the castle defenders didn't just stand around and wait. What do you think they did? Take a guess. They placed multiple basins of water on the ground. If the water inside was rippling from vibrations, it meant there was digging going on somewhere. This was the medieval equivalent of a seismograph. They also dug counter tunnels to intersect the enemy's tunnel and fight there, not holding hands but swinging swords. Fighting with swords inside a dark, narrow, oxygen-deprived tunnel, this is the historical version of the close quarters combat on a tight map at low FPS scenario, and most likely both of them ended up dead. But at least it was a dramatic death, we have to give it that. And then there's one of the most important battles during a siege: psychological warfare. The enemy army wasn't just applying physical pressure. Sometimes they'd make noise all night long, preventing those inside from sleeping, and send demoralizing messages. Offers like, "Surrender and we'll treat you well," the vast majority of which were empty talk, or the opposite. Threats like, "If you don't surrender, we'll leave no one alive." To deliver these messages, they'd tie them to the ends of arrows and shoot them straight into the castle. This was the medieval DM, and there was no way to block the incoming messages. As the people inside read these messages, they split into two camps. Some chose surrender, others chose to resist to the end. And this internal conflict sometimes escalated and had even more impact than the enemy's assault itself. A divided defense was the greatest luxury for an already exhausted enemy. The most critical element of a siege: timing. In the Middle Ages, Sieges rarely began in winter because the army itself needed somewhere to ride out the cold. But when a siege that started in summer stretched into autumn, both sides were weakened and struggling to fight. Disease wasn't only inside the castle, it was spreading through the enemy army doing the besieging too. Their morale steadily dropping, and their mental state deteriorating. And when all of this came together, the enemy would withdraw on their own. For castle defenders, this was the kind of victory that felt like we won because the server crashed, or not satisfying, but a win's a win. History books aren't big fans of these embarrassing victories. The hero of the book is supposed to win through an epic sword fight. But in reality, history is mostly a science built on logistics and intestinal disease. Now I need to confess something here on YouTube. When I was researching this topic, I ran into so much dry, uninteresting information that at some point even I wanted to stop researching. But since I've always loved castle siege scenes in movies, I thought that if I approached this in the channel's style, a little ironic, a little personal perspective, the video would be more engaging. I know history books are sometimes written in such a dry and sterile tone that your eyes start closing. But real medieval history is so colorful, so absurd, and so full of, wait, seriously, moments that it's just begging to be told. That's exactly why we're here. Let's pour a little sauce on history so it goes down easier. Finally, let me say this. The best way to survive a siege was to not be there in the first place. The smartest people of the Middle Ages were probably the ones living quietly outside the city, in the fields, in a small village, far from the noise of war, protected from disease, at least able to breathe fresh air. So if you found a time machine and went back to the 1250s, your career goal should not be castle commander. It should be invisible farmer in a remote village. Or you could be a castle commander and find yourself having to deal with everything I just described. Anyway, that's all for today. If you want videos like this to keep showing up in your feed, hit the like button. If after watching this video, you still believe you'd want to live in the Middle Ages, I respect your opinion. And at the same time, I strongly recommend you make a doctor's appointment because you've got a deeply unhealthy romanticism going on. And that, ironically, was also a very common condition in the Middle Ages. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It won't send you back to that era, but at least it'll make the algorithm happy. And making the algorithm happy is, in today's world, just as important as surviving a siege.